Many in the international community believe that the West Bank is illegally occupied by the State of Israel. In this 7-part series, we examine this assumption and determine what international law has to say about it. In addition to relying on relevant legal precedents, treaties, and customary international law, beginning with the formative historic events of the early 20th century, our analysis is based on the authoritative legal treaties on the subject, The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel Under International Law by legal scholar Howard Grief. In part 4 of this video series, we discuss the meaning of the term Palestinian within the legal framework of international law, and the resulting total confusion that exists in the world today over the correct use of the term. Now, in part 5, we will expand this discussion while outlining some of the ways since 1967 in which the government of the State of Israel itself has undermined the sovereign legal title of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Let's begin with a pretty simple question. Where did the idea of occupied territories come from in the first place? After the War of Independence ended, the State of Israel acted in accordance with Israeli law, laws that we'll discuss in the next video, and annexed the areas of the Jewish national home that were held secure by the Israeli Defense Forces. This included Beersheba, Nazareth, Ramla, Lod, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Eilat, and so on. Most of these areas were outside of what the UN General Assembly Resolution 181, in its illegal and illegitimate partition plan, had intended for the Jewish state. Nevertheless, there was no massive outcry in the international community over Israel's annexation of these portions of its national home. Why not? Because the State of Israel acted in accordance with its own laws and annexed land that it held the legal sovereign title to according to international law. However, after the Six-Day War ended, which we discussed in the last video, the Israeli government ignored its own laws, the Law and Administration Ordinance, the Area of Jurisdiction and Powers Ordinance, and the Law of Return, and did not annex most of the areas of the Jewish national home held by the Israeli Defense Forces. Rather, the Gaza Strip, Judea, and Samaria, that is the West Bank, along with the Sinai Peninsula, remained under Israel's military rule. It's fundamentally important to understand that the failure to annex these areas of the national Jewish home gave the false impression to the world community and also to many Israeli citizens that they were occupied territories that didn't legally belong to the Jewish people. We'll speak more about this in part 6, but in the meantime understand that they were not occupied territories under Israeli rule. Rather, they were repossessed parts of the Jewish national home that have not yet been annexed to the State of Israel. To follow up from what we demonstrated in video 4 regarding the term Palestinian, 3 significant events took place after the Six-Day War that contributed to the emergence in the public consciousness of an Arab Palestinian people. The first was what we just mentioned in the previous slide, the fact that the Israeli government failed to annex Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. The second was the fact that as a result of the war in 1967, these areas of the Jewish national home were abruptly cut off from their previous 19-year-old Egyptian and Jordanian rule. And third was the advancement of Yasser Arafat as the leader of the so-called PLO in 1969. Simply put, it was the merging of these 3 historical developments that helped spread the false narrative of a so-called Palestinian Arab people. Before we see how the government of the State of Israel exacerbated this false narrative, we need to briefly trace the major developments in the international community's perspective regarding this so-called Palestinian Arab people. After the Six-Day War ended, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242 on November 22, 1967. The resolution is interesting on a number of counts, and we won't take the time here to outline the numerous problems with the resolution. That's a separate study in and of itself. But rather, we will draw your attention to two rather positive points. First, the resolution recognized only a refugee problem, not a Palestinian refugee problem, not an Arab-Palestinian refugee problem, not even an Arab refugee problem, just a refugee problem. This wording was deliberate because it was also intended to convey recognition of the hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been made refugees by being exiled from the various Arab countries in which they had been previously resident. Second, the resolution was totally rejected by the so-called PLO because the resolution did not recognize a Palestinian people. However, by 1969, the political winds changed. In contradiction to international law, the UN General Assembly Resolution 2535 of December the 10th, 1969, explicitly referred to Palestinian Arab refugees as the people of Palestine and claimed the existence of inalienable rights of the people of Palestine. And by 1974, the UN had upped the ante on this false narrative with the UN General Assembly Resolution 3236 of November the 22nd, stating that this so-called Palestinian people had the right to self-determination, the right to national independence and sovereignty, and the inalienable right to return to their homes. But none of these so-called rights exist anywhere in any document of international law. And they don't exist because there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. They're just Arabs. And the Arabs were already given those rights, especially the right of self-determination, all throughout the Middle East, with the exception of the land of Israel, or Palestine. The Arabs have the right to national independence in Syria, in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, and so on, but they do not have that right within Palestine. But other than not annexing the territories of the national Jewish home that were under control of the Israeli Defense Forces, Israel made no positive action toward undermining its own sovereignty, at least not until 1978. As a result of the Camp David summit, representatives of the government of the State of Israel signed a framework for peace in the Middle East and a framework for the conclusion of a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. In those documents, Israel recognized the so-called, quote, Palestinian people, end quote. Further, until 1994, Israel maintained a solid case in international law for exercising its sovereign legal rights over Transjordan. With the signing of the peace treaty with Jordan, Israel, in violation of international law and in violation of the trust that was given to it by the Jewish people, recognized the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of Jordan over eastern Palestine. But the question should be asked, can the Jewish people who assigned their sovereign legal rights to the Israeli government in trust take action against the Israeli government for malfeasance? Time will tell. But without a dramatic shift in the internal politics of Jordan and Israel and possibly elsewhere, the Jewish people may not be able to do much about regaining their sovereign legal rights over Transjordan. Once the Israeli government started to go down this road, matters went from bad to worse. In the infamous Declaration of Principles signed in Oslo in 1993, it officially recognized the PLO as the official representative of this fictitious Palestinian people and agreed to the illegal transfer of parts of the Jewish national home in the land of Israel to Arabs of the Palestinian Authority. And then in at least 3 separate agreements, the Interim Agreement of 1995, the Wye River Agreement of 1998, and the Sharm el-Sheikh Memorandum of 1999, Israel agreed to transfer its powers and responsibilities in Judea and Samaria, that's the West Bank, to the Palestinian Authority, accompanied by the redeployment of its military. For those of you who have watched this video series from part 1 and internalized the facts of history relevant to the subject, It should now be more than obvious to you that the government of the State of Israel violated the sacred trust of the Jewish people to protect and take care of their sovereign legal territory, their national Jewish home. Besides these actions being a serious breach of sacred trust, the government of the State of Israel also violated Israeli law, and it should be asked whether in fact they also violated the law against treason. Subsection A of Article 97 of Israel's Penal Code states, "A person who, with intent to impair the sovereignty of the state, commits an act calculated to impair such sovereignty is liable to the death penalty or to imprisonment for life." And subsection B of that same law states, "A person who, with intent that any area be withdrawn from the sovereignty of the state or placed under the sovereignty of a foreign state, commits an act calculated to bring this about is liable to the death penalty or life imprisonment." Further, Article 100 states, "A person who does any act evincing one of the intentions referred to in sections 97, 98, 99 is liable to imprisonment for 10 years. Indeed, this is a very, very serious matter. In Part 6 of this video series, we'll focus our attention specifically on the West Bank, what has been historically referred to as Judea and Samaria.